Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk, sponsored by Inglis and Darley. My name's Brent O'Brien, and joining me, as per usual, is Tim Rowe. This week, questions are being asked about the future of Australia's two-year-old racing model as participation continues to decline. New Zealand confronts sweeping industry reform proposals, and Western Australia, our questions in Western Australia are delays in race day swab testing. We'll also examine the growing influence of racing-themed computer games, review this season's premiership battles, and hear about Tim's trip to Malaysia and for the country's richest race. In wagering, Labor clarifies its gambling reform agenda. Japanese punters are set to gain access to the Everest and the Melbourne Cup, and Racing Queensland looks for solutions to declining field sizes. Tim, let's sort of get the story I wrote yesterday, kick things off, about, I guess, two-year-old participation in Australia. And I guess for for data nerds like my good self, this is probably not necessarily a surprising story. It's something I've been following for a little while in terms of where that participation sits. And it's generally been a theme that trainers have been least likely to send their horses to two-year-old racing. What is interesting that over the course of this century, so since 2000, and you and I can both remember 2000, a bunch of our audience probably will, it's pretty much halved. Like, the numbers sort of down to around that 2,100, 2,150 per season, as from down to sort of 3,900, at that period. The overall number of horses racing has declined, but only by sort of an order sort of 10 to 15%. So it's pretty clear from those stats, Tim, that, it's inarguable that two-year-old racing is a much less of a focus for Australian racing and for Australian trainers.
Exactly. I mean, it's just interesting why that would be. And I read your story pointing out that the foal crop has dropped, but still the number of races or two-year-olds have, declined far more than the foal crop has. I mean, even when you put your story up last night, I noticed a comment from Blake Ryan, who obviously breezes up a lot of two-year-olds. So that, and he mentioned the synthetic or artificial tracks might have something to do with it as well, which, I would back his opinion, because such a fine line trying to get horses to breeze up in sort of September to their optimum without them going shin sore would be important. And also, there's no anabolic steroids over the last sort of, I don't know how many decades, but that's a small role in it, I think. And the other factor, correct me if I'm wrong, or just my opinion, that also as the bloodstock values have risen sharply over the last decade. If you go to the major sales, Magic Millions of January, of course, Easter, all of them, it's costs a lot of money to buy a nice yearling. What's Magic Millions average more than 200,000. Easter's sort of closer to 300, sometimes more.
Well,
That's a lot of money to invest. You don't want to bust them up in the first prep or early in the season if you don't have to.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Look, what I will do is I'll play you a snippet from what this prompted was a discussion I had with Adrian Bott last week, just not long after the podcast, Tim, where we were talking about sort of direction of Tulloch Lodge. And obviously no one's been more famous for their two-year-olds than Gabe Waterhouse over the years. But it's clear that they're moving away from it. They're not going to abandon it by any stretch of the imagination, but the strategy of being sort of two-year-old led has definitely changed. And this is what Adrian had to say about the sort of, I guess the strategy of what type of horses they're looking for.
Definitely like strategy change within the business. Obviously, we're always sort of, there's been a bit of a transition there at times. We are at times quite heavily focused on or geared towards two-year-old racing, I would say. Yeah. So naturally that limits the number of races that you can be sort of looking at year on year. If you have if you have a quieter year, we'll buy some more horses that just sort of need that little bit more time or later maturing. It's sort of a season or two before you see those sort of flow-on effects, and we try not to pigeonhole ourselves too much with the yearling selections, so might have been a bit quieter on the two-year-old front this year, but I'd like to think that can then set us up for some better years going forward with some horses to yet hit the track that are sort of a bit more later maturing, and we can see that through their sort of 3 and 4 year old careers, and then that's where we'll see the numbers and the starters, and because ultimately if you need those sort of types of horses and run that type of operation to be staying relevant and staying competitive with, like you said, the other trainers that have got significant sort of numbers and starters and winners. It's hard to do that just operating as a 2-year-old stable.
The interesting thing about it, Tim, is that there is still value in two-year-old racing. If you look down, if you go through the article that I wrote, if you look at the sort of key returns from two-year-old racing, while the fact that the average two-year-old in a season earns less than the average horse, but it has a lot fewer runs. So actually, if you break it down roughly to the amount an average 2-year-old earns per run in Australia, and this is approximate data, so I'm not saying it's absolute gospel, but I think I'm pretty much, within a sort of 10 to 20% sort of a window on this. It's $13,300 per start for a 2-year-old compared to $7,150 for an ERD. So it's interesting from that perspective that I understand why trainers are moving away from it, and there's a desirability from owners to have horses that sort of, persist longer and whatever else. We've got a bloodstock market, a commercial market that is obsessed with precocity and talks about precocity a lot. We've got a commercial breeding market that sits within that. There's a few interesting sort of disconnects around this. Meanwhile, on top of that, we've got a wagering market which doesn't tend to like 2-year-old racing, both because it's not programmed very well, i.e., it's usually programmed early and on Saturdays and race days where there's not as much wagering engagement. But as a rule, Australians aren't as highly engaged in 2-year-old racing because of the uncertain form lines, etc., etc. There's a few sort of mixed messages about how we go forward with this, Tim, because I guess the question is, if we establish the fact that people are less likely to have 2-year-old racing, 2-year-olds do provide some good value in terms of getting money back, but as a rule, from a wagering perspective, they're probably not as rewarding as other races. Where does that leave the racing industry in terms of where it should be taking its product, and it should evolve the 2-year-old product?
Well, I think they've already sort of headed in that direction. I'm thinking, there's not that many, certainly New South Wales, sort of probably south of Sydney, if you want to go, Canberra's about the only club that has 2-year-old races probably till sort of February, March. There's not many options for those, outside the elite horses or horses that trainers think are elite, get them. And so that's probably another reason why there isn't many runners, because again, there's actually, my horse isn't ready or good enough to be targeting some of those stakes races, or I don't want to crucify them with the, if they do run a placing and their rating is just goes through the roof. I think that's another factor. That, I'll just put them back in the paddock because there's no, and they get them broken in later, or they just take them slower because there's no races. So it'll be a function of that. I think administrators will go, well, the horses aren't here, so we'll program fewer races, and trainers will go, well, there's no races for me, so I'll tip them back out to the paddock.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma of what happens here, but I think whatever happens, the conversation needs to be had on a broader thoroughbred industry level, because if there's a significant reset from racing authorities that, hey, 2-year-old racing, we're going to move away from it, not completely, but, it becomes much more of a, then what does that do for the bloodstock market, Tim? Because you and I know how closely the marketing aligned with that is really strong. And I've had a conversation this morning with, someone from a sales company saying, really interesting article, it's probably something we need to think about.
Well, Magic Millions is probably, and Inglis for that matter. Inglis has the Inglis Nursery before Christmas. Obviously, Magic Millions, to coincide with their sale in January, is such a great marketing ploy and great, holiday destination at that time of year. People go up and enjoy all the festivities around the sale. But we've already seen, if there's fewer and fewer horses being ready and able to race on the Gold Coast, that's got to be a question mark longer term. The next 5-10 years for the Magic Millions and Racing Queensland to consider whether they move that away. I'm sure from a marketing point of view you wouldn't want to, but maybe they're forced into it.
Yeah, I mean, it does just change the nature of it completely. And I think the other thing that this plays into, Tim, is that with what you mentioned before, alluded to about the declining foal crop, which obviously had some impact on the amount of 2-year-olds racing. Obviously, that's the case. But what does that do for the amount of racing we can have in Australia, particularly after your story last week, that international horses are becoming harder to buy, and there's much fewer international horses coming to Australia. At some point, our overall horse population, which actually has been, like, as I mentioned before, it is, you know, 10-15% off from what it was 20 years ago, but it's pretty good. Like, it's been pretty steady in the last few years, around that 28,000 active thoroughbred sort of number. What happens to that if suddenly it goes to 24,000 and suddenly you can't sustain those meetings? And does that mean that suddenly you're looking at, what venues can have races and all that type of stuff? I mean, racing needs to be sort of thinking, what does 20 years ahead look like, not what 5 minutes ahead looks like.
Yeah, definitely. And, some part of that is programming races for the suitable horse population, whether it's benchmark 45s right through to Group 1 horses, I think, and we'll talk about it in a minute with New Zealand. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, maybe it is some of those country meetings that I love may fall by the wayside, unfortunately.
Yeah, that was actually the segue I was going to make then, was into New Zealand. We've had the Project Stamina announcement this week, which has outlined 5 thoroughbred race courses, which, are proposed for closure. Now, there's no guarantee they're going to be closed at this stage. There's still some consultancy to be done, but the project has been basically gone away to look at that, as well as a host of harness and some sort of both harness and thoroughbred venues. It's a very emotive issue, closing race courses, Tim. Like, it's not an easy one to do, but New Zealand have been talking about this for a very long time, including in the Sire report, which I think what was 2018, 2017, Tim, around about then. It seems to have sort of got to a point now to continue to talk about these things, but it was just sort of interesting to see the reaction out of the Project Stamina stuff. It's very emotive and a very difficult issue when you're trying to talk to people about losing their racing clubs and what that may look like. And there's they know once they get that. And the other thing too is like literally the Project Stamina would barely hit the desk, and you've got local politicians putting their bib in saying, "Yep, we'll take Trentham Racecourse for a high density housing." You know, it's broader than just racing. This discussion about land and racing, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, well, as we know in Australia as well. But look, there's multiple sides and arguments, and we see that, as you say, very emotive, and people are passionate about the industry, and the industry relies on that. But I think if you look at it objectively, something has to change in New Zealand. They have to make some very tough calls and upset some people. And again, I can't say whether this is 100% the correct way through Project Stamina, but they have to rationalise, just because there's not enough money to go around to feed everyone and sustain it. And you don't want the industry to die altogether. So unfortunately, there will be casualties, and yeah, it is sad, but you don't want the industry to die altogether.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase that was used in the report is overvalued and undercapitalised, and and it's a difficult decision that has to be made. Put in a bit of further context today, Tim, by what you've just written, actually literally just been published as we're speaking, that owner, breeder and administrator Paul Humphreys has been elected the chair of the New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing, replacing the outgoing Russell Warwick. This is an interesting one because one of the criticisms of NZTR, and we've spoken to Matt Balesti, and we've got to know him relatively well in his short time in the role. But one of the criticism is that the industry doesn't feel like they're getting the leadership or I guess the direction that they need at the top. I don't know a lot about Paul Humphreys, but I mean, what's your sort of perspective about how this one will land?
I just, again, it's hard to say. I don't know Paul either, but reading the release and his background, obviously successful businessman in construction industry. So again, maybe it's that objective look at it that he can bring to the table. Obviously, Russell Warwick, very respected figure in the industry, but comes from the inside the bubble, so to speak, as a industry person who's worked in it and passionate about it, where maybe Paul can look at it from the outside, as well as being an owner, breeder, racing club chair and president and all that over the past. So, I don't know. It's just going to be a very interesting time that, again, they have to make decisions, and I'm sure not every hard decision they make will turn out to be the right one, but no decisions is not the way forward, because nothing will happen, nothing will change, and the current direction can't continue.
Yeah,
If you look at it, well, that's the way I interpret it anyway.
yeah. I mean, the reports are believe there's a fiscal cliff sitting there, Tim, ready to fall off in a couple of years' time, which is going to cause them a whole bunch of trouble. So there's there's some significant issues for New Zealand to confront, and I guess, Tim, there's context for this back in Australia as well. As I said, we sort of delved into that from the other side, but there's some lessons to be learned out of this. And yeah, I think the other thing too is that racing by its nature is very opinionated and there's a lot of strong ideas and whatever else, and you only have to go online to see where that sits. It's a hard task to try to please people where people do, but you've also got a responsibility to be custodians of the sport as well. So this is going to be a really difficult period of change for New Zealand. I think you and we indicated, I think there's a necessary period of change here, but it could define how it relates with the participants going forward. And it's very hard to run a sport if your participants aren't on your side. So it feels like at the moment it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, but they will definitely be damned if they don't. So be interested to see how that works out. Over in WA, who currently undergoing their own racing review over there and other things going on in WA at the moment. Tim, a story you broke out of there at the moment that, look, integrity is a fundamental aspect of racing. We know that. It's a really key part of it. Part of that integrity is the testing processes and all that sort of stuff. It sounds like, for the look of things, Tim, that process hasn't been straightforward. The trainers have been getting frustrated by delays in swab testing results coming through and other bits and pieces. And RAWA, the regulator over there, has sort of acted to put some more resources behind Chem Centre, who are the company that sort of run the testing regime. Is that right?
Sort of. So Chem Centre is a government organisation or
Yep.
business, and they do body of testing. Yeah, they do like police stuff for DNA testing and things, all those sorts of things for forensics for police and the coroner's court. And one of their services they offer is testing of the swabs for the racing industry. So they've got the contract through ROA to undertake that, and part of their obligations is, I think it's 25 days to return the test or the result of the test, and sort of they haven't been meeting that. Yes, 95% of the tests have come back within that time, but it's still a small portion, and I guess that the trainers argue, sort of Warwick Bradshaw, and who's head executive officer and a licensed trainer of the Thoroughbred Racehorse Owners Trainers Association over there. You know, these trainers, if they return a positive swab or a test and they get informed, later than they should have, maybe they'll throw up more positive tests that from contaminated feed or whatever the reason may be. There's all myriad of reasons why inadvertently there could be a positive test, and they're saying it's putting undue stress on the trainers. And the other factor is quite often ROA can't pay out prize money till there's returned, a clean swab and things like that, putting financial pressure on anyone who works in the industry knows it's a tight margins business training horses. So that's through ROA. Chem Centre have admitted their fault, and they are directing more resources to try and meet their obligations to turn tests around within 25 days.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess it's an aspect of the process, but it's a really important part of the process. And again, it points to the complexity of trying to run PRAs and trying to run like this is not just a straightforward, up the throat and the gates and let horses run around in a paddock. This is it's a proper industry with a lot of processes involved. And Tim, the other thing I want to touch in, or one of the other things I want to touch on before we talk about your little trip to the tropics was just as a bit of a nod to the fact that we've obviously coming to the end of the racing season now, and I covered a run the numbers the week about the jockeys that won the premierships, the Metro premierships this year, and that actually it's quite an older cohort. Craig Williams becomes the oldest ever, I believe, Melbourne jockeys premiership jockey. Craig's an extraordinary jockey when you think about how the longevity he's had and what he's been able to do. He's 49. I probably was surprised he was 49, but I kind of knew because it's kind of roughly my age because he's kind of been around as long as I have. Jason Holder, who he was a favourite jockey of mine when I was cutting my teeth as a punter in the 1990s at the smoke-filled tabs of Melbourne back in those days. 50 years old, wins his fourth Adelaide premiership, which is a great thing. We've got Willie Pike, national champion again at 40. Willie looks like he's 90, but he's actually only 40. I was surprised he was that young. But it is an interesting industry. Like there seems to be a lot of longevity. If you look at the average age of a Melbourne champion jockey, premiership jockey over the years, I think it's 31. I worked out to be. So Craig's a fair bit older than that, and these older jockeys seem to have longer lives, so that they just continue to go. And I think it's good for the sport to have this continued narrative, but it's also a credit to these guys to stay fit and to be able to sort of stay in the game and keep on riding.
I'd say so. Not knowing Craig personally or that well, but he seems to, I don't probably keep himself fit and away from sort of extracurricular activities more than most, I would say, in the riding fraternity. It sort of helps him in that regard.
Yeah, he's certainly disciplined. Like I haven't dealt with Craig for a while, but about 10 or so years ago, I sort of have cause to be in his circle, and he's a very detail-minded person. And he's off to Ukraine now to do some stuff over there. And he's just a different. Like it's great to have people that are like that. He's not just a bloke that rides a horse. In the context of that, we've also got a young jockey like James Johnson coming along in Melbourne. Rode 4 winners yesterday. Come across from Tasmania. Like the riding ranks in Australia, deserves their credit. And that we haven't even mentioned James McDonald, who, has won his 10th Sydney Metro Premiership and, will break every single record on the books in Australian racing by the time he's finished. He's an extraordinary rider, J-Mac. We've spoken plenty about him, but worth acknowledging him too. And it just was interesting to have a look at that. And then obviously we had the winners of the trainers premierships around Australia and as well. So, acknowledging those sort of typical Metro names that have done so well over the years. But acknowledging Michael Grantham winning the I think on the last day in WA. So in the Metro. Look, I suppose what they are, there's probably not massive monetary rewards or whatever else, but they are time-honoured things that we celebrate in terms of success of trainers and jockeys, and it's good to be able to acknowledge it, isn't it, Tim?
Sure.
Let's move on, Tim, to acknowledging your little trip to Malaysia, obviously to Selangor on the weekend. Interesting little few days over there. Obviously, a bit of success for the stable. You're good mates with Simon Dunnerdale, I know, but also to be over there and sort of see the way that Malaysian racing is tracking. We've been watching it quite closely, not just because of your own personal interest, but because of, I guess, the impact of the closure of Singapore and what does that mean for Malaysian racing. I mean, what are you seeing over there, Tim, in terms of the engagement and where things sit?
Well, it's interesting. I did go over sort of 2 years ago before the introduction of this million ringgit race, which is about 350,000 Aussie. And there wasn't, to be honest, I think it was just a run of the mill meeting. There wasn't that many people on the course. But on Sunday, the club, and Saturday for that matter, without a race meeting, marketed it very heavily. Kids' activities, there was pony rides and animal farms and all sorts of different things. And yes, in Australia, we might blow up too, going, oh, we're forgetting about the punter and, having music and dance concerts and whatever at the races, music concert. But club over there, it is a Muslim country, so it's not as easy to market, come and get drunk or, come and gamble. So they attract a lot of people there that probably hadn't been to a race course before or very often. They had a great time when the jockey CC Wong came back to scale on the winner, Aquitaine. They were cheering and clapping over the rails. It was quite surreal, and I'm not sure they probably didn't even have a bet, but they just recognised the thrill. And having spoken to CC afterwards, and he's ridden with success in Singapore and Korea more recently. He said it was one of the most unique experiences he's had, with the number of people cheering and carrying on. So I think that's good for the club. And from a bloodstock perspective, the first four across the line were all English Digital horses. The winner and the third place getter trained by Chris Waller before they were sold over there, and the runner-up was trained by Kieran Ma, Jazz Club he was called. So it's a really important market for now, without Macau and Singapore to take some of those horses. And given the momentum and the appeal from the owners, I think they'll start to probably up their spend a little bit more to try and win races such as the Selangor Mile going forward.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like that obviously you alluded to there with the English horses, like there is an export market there too for Australia, and obviously losing Singapore has been a bit of a setback for in terms of some of those horses going up there. It would appear that there's a bit more there's a bit more scope up there for some of these horses with these bigger races to actually end up head up towards there. Some of the Australian and New Zealand bred horses, Tim.
Definitely. The favourite, who was unplaced, he's sort of a bit of a nutcase. He's from New Zealand and actually made his way via Hong Kong. I got told that they couldn't actually get him onto the track in Hong Kong and sold him to Malaysia, and Lawson Moy's done a good job with that horse. Just sort of didn't get a plan on the day. Look, it hasn't replaced Singapore. Singapore was buying those $150,000, $200,000 horses there, and Hong Kong were probably 200 and above. So it hasn't replaced that yet, but it is heading in the right direction. And they're buying a lot of horses from the 2-year-old sales as well, and privately. So, look, it's an important market when there's not that many that are prepared to probably, if you talk to Philippines and in Korea even, they're probably buying $10,000 and $20,000 horses just to try and get that buffer that buy $50,000 plus that the traders and trainers need to on sell to continue to run their businesses.
The following segment is brought to you by Inglis. Entries are now open for the 2026 Inglis Ready to Race sale, Australasia's leading breeze-up sale, and the auction that produced Group 1 winning colts, Tron Bolt and Libertad this season. The sale continues to set the benchmark, recording a gross of more than $20 million in 2025 with 81% clearance rate and $100,000 median. Buyers from across Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong and beyond continue to target the sale for its proven results and outstanding graduates. The 2025 English Ready to Race sale will be held at Riverside on October 15. The entry is closing August 7th. Visit inglis.com.au for more information. Tim, just a visit to the breeding and bloodstock space, and just a quick look at as I mentioned before, we're coming to the end of the season. Sires titles will be decided, or kind of have already pretty much been decided for the season so far. Snitzel's, I covered this earlier on the week, but Snitzel's had an extraordinary season, and it's been, it's been quite amazing the season the season after we lost him, that he's had such an amazing, dominant performance to win quite comfortably from Zoustar and the general size. Home Affairs, we know, has had a very strong season in the first season sire ranks, and he'll easily win that. Second season, as I go through it now, as when I last looked at it, Tim, and I was just about to have a look at it now, we had Bivouac on top, narrowly on top from Wooten Bassett. He remains on top by about $80,000 heading into the second last day of the year, so you'd think he would hold on there. Two-year-old sires is an interesting battle, but it looks like Snitzel will hold on there. He's about $36,000 ahead of Home Affairs heading into the last day, so that's probably unlikely to change in that space. And Premier Size will be won by Fastnet Rock, so quite comfortably. The only battle really, or the interesting battle will go down the wire is, as things stand at the moment, Zoostar and Capitalists are equal for most amount of winners for the season. So, look, I mean, it's been an interesting season in that regard. It probably does pose a question, Tim, which I put in the newsletter earlier in the week. What now beyond Snitzel, Baby Zoostar? Who's the next champion sire? Is it the Autumn Sun? There's a whole bunch of, interesting questions around that, isn't there?
It is, and sort of we're talking about the trainers not focusing as much on two-year-old racing that, Home Affairs got better at 3 or won his big races at 3 certainly. So I would expect, and could be wrong, that those horses, Home Affairs, more of them will come out at 3 or will train on, I think. So to be positivity with him at this stage, I think everyone's entitled to be optimistic about his chances and a few others, and even Bivouac. I'm a fan of that horse. He got better at 4 as well, and his progeny is sort of tracking that way. They're probably fair to say a hard sell first season yearlings, but you get the right one, they're good horses. And from what I can see or I've heard around the traps, breeders are recognising that this year as well with booking mares into him.
Yeah, yeah. There's some interesting sort of dynamics coming through, especially when you've got some really strong younger sires, including, as I mentioned, the Autumn Sun, Too Darn Hot. Harry Angel's had a really good year, but also there's a whole bunch of other sires as well that are sort of coming through, and we've been waiting for that for a little while. There's probably been a bit of a gap in the middle. Certainly beyond Zoostar, it hasn't been clear who will be the next champion stallion. The ranks are sort of interestingly poised moving forward, and we'll see what goes on. Looking forward to 2027. Tim, Magic Millions confirmed, I think, last Friday their calendar for the next season. Only a couple of small changes really, but the Tasmanian sale moving a week earlier. But not many surprises in terms of the schedule, but it does enable us to have a look at it. Start thinking about the sale season, which probably only 2 or 3 months after we finished with the last sale season.
Rolls around so quickly, doesn't it? Yeah, but just I guess the swapping around of, as you say, Tassie sale first probably doesn't impact anyone apart from probably a very few buyers that do both sales and obviously Magic Millions who have to run both sales. So there's generally a flight Monday night out of Tassie straight to Perth. I've caught that one before. So it is a taxing week for them, and I think next year might be the last year in the calendar for a little while, for a few years anyway, where there's only a week between Magic Millions and Karaka. That for the professional marketplace, that all the big stables and agents do attend both sales, and then straight into Inglis Classic is sort of a taxing start to the year. But that's just the way the calendar falls. Otherwise, if Magic Millions hold it too early, horses will be leaving farms and things like Christmas Day and Boxing Day and inspections sort of 28. It's just too early in the year, or just too soon after Christmas. So it's just unavoidable.
Yeah, at least the Easter sale goes back to its normal sort of thing next year, which will create a bit less of a condensed feeling. I think last year was 2 weeks shorter, and it felt like it was a bit of a sprint across a long distance, didn't it? Trying to get through all those sales last year. So I think the cadence of the sales season is really important to success. It's fair enough to say. The following segment is brought to you by Darley. You only have to look at the names. Dubai Millennium, Dubawi, Too Darn Hot, Broadsiding, Night of Thunder, Ombudsman, Gayaf. It's a line that keeps moving the breed forward. And now there's Observer, a Group 1 Australian Guineas winner and a Group 1 Victoria Derby winner, the next generation of the Dubawi dynasty, standing this season at Darley. Tim, I put a little discussion point in here based upon my sort of own interest, I suppose. Last week I was sitting there thinking, I had been looking about this, a little bit of buzz around this Full Stride game, which is a basically computer game / PlayStation, Xbox, whatever. Actually not an Xbox at the moment, it's only on Steam and PlayStation. Built out of Japan, horse racing, riding, participation game. And it sort of took me back to a conversation you and I and a couple of others had around about sort of races, games that we played when we were younger and how these things came through. And I'm happy to talk about the game itself. I've probably played 2 or 3 hours of it so far, just as a bit of a muck around. But sort of the broader importance of those things as engagement. I mean, you and I have both talked about Good to Firm as a game that we both played as younger lads, as probably a complementary activity to our betting activity as young lads. But it was a really interesting game as a teenager in the 90s to grow up playing a game which sort of gave you a understanding of British racing and the structure of British racing and where things at and the names, the way the horses were named. There was betting options amongst it. Obviously, you couldn't ride the horse, but you could train the horse and you could yeah, there's all sorts of things about it. Like the engagement I developed through that game in particular, and there's not other people in my family as well. My brother got obsessed by it as well. Was quite significant, and you could see then the value, and that was about the time when the FIFA games started coming out, and they've become like a $30 billion juggernaut now. The soccer games and the other former EA Sports games and all that sort of stuff about the participatory aspect of horse racing that can be yielded through computer games. I mean, what are your memories of that, Tim?
Yeah, it was good to firm, and I guess, yeah, it was that thrill of being able to train the horse or appear to have some sort of control and what races and things like that. And then I got a phone account, and that sort of became even more intriguing than good to firm. But I think it's a good way of, yeah, it's a good introduction. People that aren't from a racing family or a punting family or anything like that that come across the game and become engaged that way, and then you you move on to oh, this is a live sport. What a great sport it is, an industry, and all the job we work in it, the jobs that are available, and it is a terrific industry, and it's that I think now it's a great way for new audiences to be able to be attracted to racing because it is a hard. There's a lot of competition with all the football codes and everything else that for discretionary income. I think it'll play an important role along with social media over the last more than a decade, probably 15 years, trying to attract new people to the sport.
Yeah, and I think, like, you sort of see the evolution of that, and this game, Full Stride, sort of owes its sort of, I guess, it's very much a look towards the gallop racer slash champion jockey sort of era of Japanese-focused racing and I guess orientation. Obviously, the structure of racing, all that type of stuff, and obviously it has a global application. But those games are also games you played a lot at going through. There was the Melbourne Cup, I can't remember, Melbourne Cup Challenge, I think it was called. It was quite good. It was a little bit different in terms of the playability. It probably wasn't quite as disciplined in terms of the playability, but obviously had the appeal of doing it. I remember actually going back to Guild to Firm, you could actually change the race program. And so I remember me and my brother spent a considerable amount of time basically redesigning the Australian pattern to be based around that. And there was a few little bugs in the game, for example, that sprinting horses didn't get any slower as they get to like 15 and 16. So I think I won the Newmarket handicap 11 times in a row or something with the same horse, but probably a little bit of a bug of the system back then. But this Full Stride game, it's actually quite difficult to get used to start with. I've got a few bugs with it. The horses throw their heads around like maniacs. There's a few other issues around it at the moment. But the developer, which is, I think it's Blue Bullet, they're developing out of Japan, they're sort of continue to improve it and develop it. There's always going to be people that are going to knock these things to start with. But I think the participation thing is huge. I think this is quite interesting because probably this appeals to people like myself who don't mind having, have grown up playing sports games, don't mind having a sort of, that sort of option. But then beyond that, to a next generation, I can literally say it's the next generation because I've got a son who's, in his teenage years who has played Umamasame, which is a very different engagement tool, but that's about developing understanding of horsing and also horse racing and horse racing culture and key names around that sort of stuff. And I think racing needs to look to have a multiple strategy in this regard, Tim, is that it's not just sort of making you and I feel good about the days of old or feeling like we're part of it. It's about bringing a new generation of people and exposing them to key information about racing or whatever else that doesn't, it doesn't need to be centered around wagering necessarily, but actually gives them an understanding of, the importance of the big names and the understanding, because more so than any other era, and what the FIFA, and I talk about FIFA in terms of the game itself, what the FIFA era did was bring out the individuals. That people didn't just support Man United or Man City or Liverpool anymore. They supported Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi and all that type of stuff. So the ability to develop that fan engagement around that stuff is really crucial. And as we know, Tim, nobody does it better than Japan, do they?
No, exactly right. They are obsessed, and little plushies and things like that at the races. And I've seen actually there's a few of them at
Got one here, actually.
Selangor on a Sunday as well. The plushies, I saw quite a few of them going around. So
Well, I think it has
getting another
applications.
engagement.
I was going to say, it has applications to different cultures and how things work, and what happens in Japan doesn't have to work here. But it's an interesting game, and I'll continue to play it and work through it. I don't have the time that I used to spend a lot of time. I've probably got an hour or two a week to actually play those games, but I'll continue to fire it up every now and then and have a bit of a go and see what it's like, and hopefully it develops. And yeah, I just think it does help. Like there is a sense of enjoyment that you get from it that's different from having a bet and everything else, and it's complementary. And I think anything which helps to sort of spread the understanding of racing, and you've got champion Japanese horses in there and all that sort of stuff, can only be a positive thing. Anyway, just something I thought I'd put out there. Looking for your next opportunity in racing, breeding, or wagering? Or searching for the right person to join your team? The Straight Jobs is the industry's dedicated careers platform connecting employers with talented professionals right across the thoroughbred sector. For the latest opportunities in industry careers, go to jobs.thestraight.com.au. Tim, just on to wagering quickly, and I'll sort of get through the Labor Party have basically said they won't be imposing a national regulator on wagering. They will empower the current regulators to have more powers. Part of the national conference last week, they sort of reviewed that and worked through it. We'll see what goes forward. We'll continue to talk about this issue. I think August 17th, the Senate review comes back into it. The government wants to get their reforms in by January 1. I feel like that date might be a bit optimistic, but we'll see how that go. Leaning back on Japan for a minute, Tim, and talking about that, interesting to see this week that the JRA gave approval for the Melbourne. Well, actually, it wasn't the JRA; it was the Ministry of Fisheries or something. I don't know what they're called in Japan. Ministry of Forestries and Fisheries gave approval for the Melbourne Cup and the Everest to be bet on by Japanese punters. Now, Japanese punters haven't been able to bet on through the JRA on the Melbourne Cup since 2020 and never on the Everest. They only bet where there's a Japanese horse involved. I think it was 96 international events added to the register, which is interesting. But what was also interesting for me, Tim, I looked at the JRA figures for the 2024 Cox Plate, where Prognosis contested the race and was comfortably beaten by Via Sistina, as you might remember. $3.5 million was turned over on the tote. Now, how much of that goes through to the local clubs is probably not massive, but it still seems a decent amount of money to be turning over on a foreign race on a Saturday in October.
Sure, any revenue for the clubs in the industry adds up. It's like Whirlpool, and we can debate the takeout rates and all that. But from a club point of view, and I think Victoria, correct me if I'm wrong, Bren, that goes to the PRA, where in New South Wales, for instance, it goes to the ATs.
It goes to the club. It goes to the Club of Victoria too, Tim.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. So,
and it was a minimal amount. According to Moonee Valley, I'd heard that it was a minimal amount, but it wasn't. But it was more of a prestige thing, I suppose, to have that. But still, if we get a Japanese horse in the Everest and a Japanese horse in the Melbourne Cup, it does change things. And I think we've had Japanese runners in the last 3 Melbourne Cup, Tim. So it's been a bit of a renaissance. Obviously, Warp Speed running second quite narrowly a couple of years ago. So it's an interesting one. I think it's something that it's a global sport, as we mentioned before. So that's an interesting one. The last one I want to touch on from a wagering perspective and overall was Racing Queensland's move to, I guess, change the acceptance procedures, whereby trainers can assess races based upon these are the horses that have accepted, and they can take themselves out of the race based upon that, and to reduce the amount of horses that are scratched post-acceptances. It seems like a logical thing. There's a few people who've got a few queries about it and how people will use it and what things will look like. I guess what Racing Queensland are trying to do is they're trying to stop the fact that horses getting scratched are damaging to wagering outcomes, and they want to sort of protect the integrity of the fields, which you can understand, especially when you've got things like dual acceptors and things like that.
Look, WA Racing's had it for a long time, I think, and that it seems to work well. Sort of looking at it objectively from afar, I think it certainly has merit, particularly where in southeast Queensland, where there is quite a few options for these trainers to choose it. Do I go to the Gold Coast on a Saturday, Toowoomba Saturday night, Sunshine Coast on a Sunday, Gatton on a Monday or something? There might be 4 different races. If they go, well, I'm not going to go to Gatton because I've drawn barrier 20 or something, on a tight Kilcoy on a tight track. But, I've drawn well at the Sunshine Coast or barrier 13, the rail true. I'll come down the middle. The trainers have got options, saves money on scratching fees for owners, and it certainly has plenty of merit.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it sort of rolls out and what the results are. I'm good at Racing Queensland for taking the initiative. I know some people are willing to whack them on the head about things and say, what will this do and whatever else. But I think in the long term, the other thing too, I suppose, like in terms of acceptances and whatever else, like I think it was communicated to me that around about in terms of Saturday racing, between Wednesday acceptances and Saturday 9 a.m., which is sort of final scratching time, only around about 10% of the money is actually invested in that time, or less than 10%. I think it's like 8 or 9%. So that's kind of interesting from that perspective, but it is protecting, I guess, the ability for people to bet with confidence, knowing they won't get smashed by deductions and all that stuff will look out. So I think it just give a little bit more confidence to the market. It's good to be responsive in that space and, yeah, patting the back for Racing Queensland for making that, yeah, initiative. And it may be the case in 12 months' time it hasn't worked, but, yeah, let's give it a shot and see what happens, Tim. Anything else from you before we head off for the week?
Oh, well, as you know, I didn't know it was Thursday this morning when you said we're recording this afternoon. So, yeah, I'm just getting back into the swing of things. All clear this week.
Yeah, well, at least you're in the right hemisphere now, which is good. It wasn't quite the same with you. I assume it is just on the other side of the northern of the equator, isn't it? Malaysia. I know that's round about where Singapore is, where the I have to check that one out.
Possibly, yeah. Okay, yeah.
You don't know what happens. You didn't know what hemisphere. You didn't check which way the water ran down the drain when you're up there,
Yeah.
to work out where you were. No.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
No.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you back, and it's great to have everybody listening to us on Straight Talk. Thanks for your time. It's always great to have you to as an audience to talk us through all the week of racing, wagering, and breeding. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast wherever you're subscribing, and be sure to never miss an episode. If you have any feedback or a topic you'd like us to discuss, send us an email to brent@thestraight.com.au. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you again next week.